We've come to the Kyiv Scientific Research Institute in Ukraine's capital, where forensic experts have been analysing the weapons that have been fired by Russia at Ukraine. They've got a treasure trove of fragments of missiles and drones. Some really interesting lessons that they've gleaned here. This is part of a Kh-101 Russian missile. Interesting to us because of this hologram on it, which you might just be able to see there reflecting in the light. That has the letters of Russia's FSB intelligence service. Now, the suggestion is not that the FSB built this missile, but perhaps that they owned it or that they were involved in logging or verifying the parts. These optics here, the staff here have said that these are manufactured in Japan. They've been part of a Russian cartograph drone, which produces a 3D image of the ground as it flies over. Perhaps most sensationally, most recently, they say that these parts spread out on this table are from a Zirkon hypersonic missile. Now, this is the second type of Russian hypersonic missile that has been fired at Ukraine. The first was the Khinzal. Hypersonic missiles travel many, many times the speed of sound and can maneuver at that speed, which in theory makes them very difficult for anti-aircraft weapons to shoot down. Now, this has been identified, I understand, according to the staff here, based on pictures they've pulled off the internet, open source images of this weapon at arms fairs, which they've managed to compare to the parts they have spread out on this table. Also over here, parts from Shahad drones. Now, these are the Iranian-made one-way kamikaze attack drones that have been used, devastating effect. They're not particularly fast or sophisticated, but they're cheap, and they've been used to overwhelm Ukraine's air defences in some cases, or at least to keep it very, very busy. Now, this piece is interesting. This is a carburettor, part of the engine of a Shahad K. Now, there are different models of the Shahad. The K, we've been told by the staff here, was first used around June or July 2023. That's about 12 months after the Shahads were first used in Ukraine. The K variant manufactured in Russia. Now, this piece here is interesting because this carburettor clearly says, stamped in English letters, the word made in Ireland, and we can see the name, I think it says Tillotson there, of the manufacturer. That's not the only international part. These weapons are often full of international or foreign-made pieces. This is another carburettor. This is from an earlier version. This is from the Shahad M, one of the first Shahads fired at Ukraine. And just above my finger there, the letters of Japan clearly stamped on that part. Similarly concerning, this is the engine. You can see here the snapped off wooden propeller, pretty simple mechanism that propels these aircraft. There's the propeller. Here is the engine, very clearly written in English letters. In English, the word engine, SN for serial number, and a serial number printed there. That same, another number printed over here. Now, the suspicion is that actually this engine was manufactured in England. This also came from one of the early Shahad M's. Staff here have said, whilst they haven't confirmed it, they believe that was made in England, that engine. Those engines are no longer being used to propel the Shahids. They've been used, they're using different parts now as production has progressed. Perhaps the sanctions have kicked in and production has certainly shifted in some form from Iran to Russia. We're here at the Kyiv Institute of Scientific Research, and this is Andriy Kulchitsky, who's the head of the military laboratory, and he's been showing us around this treasure trove of missiles and drones which they have here, which have all been fired at Ukraine, and it's their job to analyse what's been fired and when it was made. So in the yard of the Institute there are shelves stacked high with all the bad bits of evidence from all the different strikes, the thousands of strikes that have taken place on this country over the last 2 years. And then outside it's more and more again. In here, more and more parts, but outside perhaps slightly easier to see here on display. That's an Iranian made Shahad M drone, one of the first variants that were used in Ukraine in the first summer of the war in about 2022. Here are a selection of landmines, mortars, artillery shells, the sorts of missiles that are sometimes fired from the multiple rocket launchers like Grads, and down here parts of much larger weapons. But actually I think the most interesting pieces are in another courtyard I'm going to go and show you now, because those are some of the most sophisticated weapons that have been fired at Ukraine. All of these weapons tell a story to the forensic investigators here in Kyiv. This is the remains of a Caliber cruise missile, the sort of missile that is fired from ships and submarines. They've been used since the start of the war to blast targets right across Ukraine with devastating impacts. But this particular Caliber cruise missile, the wreckage of this missile, tells a positive story for Ukraine, because the holes in its wings are proof that Ukraine's air defences are working. Those holes caused by explosive fragmentation from an air defence missile. Similarly, the blackened wreckage there of a KH-101, similarly shot down. These are Toshka-U missiles, an older, cruder Russian weapon, nonetheless devastating. The wreckage here is in fact a KH-69, one of Russia's more advanced weapons. Now the story here for the investigators is interesting. It comes from the serial number. They believe that the numbers painted on the side of this weapon show that it was made in the fourth quarter of 2023. Now that's really important, and it's a story that's repeated further along the line. The wreckage here is what's left of the tailpiece, the rocket boosters of a KH-32, one of Russia's largest and most destructive missiles, more than 11 meters long. Similarly, what's really interesting for the investigators is not so much what's in that wreckage there, but what's painted on the tail fin here. Now, Andrew was explaining that these numbers tell him a story. That 392 there tells him the factory where it was made. The 060 designates this as a KH-32 missile. Now that says that Russia is no longer using weapons from its old stockpiles, or rather from its pre-existing pre-war stockpiles. These sophisticated weapons are, in the words of Andriy, freshly baked, going straight from the factories to the aircraft, the launchers that are firing them at Ukraine. And that's important because it shows to Ukraine that Russia is running low on its most sophisticated weapons. It's a slightly different story with its cruder munitions, with its tanks, with its artillery shells. In those instances where it has exhausted its supplies, we know it's been drawing out vintage stocks of the very oldest kit. Just next to this is another example of one of Russia's most sophisticated weapons that again spells some good news for Ukraine. This is the nose cone, the top of a Khinzal hypersonic missile. That is one of Russia's most advanced weapons. Vladimir Putin boasted that this weapon was unstoppable. But in fact, the hole here and the hole there, we understand, was caused by the explosions of a US-made Patriot missile. Now, this wasn't the first Khinzal fired at Ukraine, but it was the first Khinzal that was shot down by a US Patriot air defense system. And sources in Kyiv have told me that since the Patriot systems arrived, the Khinzals have been consistently shot down. The unstoppable weapon has been consistently stopped. These torn metal fragments are part of a missile that hit the countryside outside Kyiv, and forensic investigators here believe that this is proof that Russia has fired a North Korean KN-23 missile at Ukraine for the first time in the two-year war. Now, they're keen to stress that their investigation is still ongoing. It hasn't been confirmed, but what they're pointing to as evidence are these large painted letters down the fuselage of the missile, which they believe is a telltale sign that it is from North Korea. They suspect this was a KN-23 missile. Now, outwardly, that looks very similar to a Russian Iskander missile. It can carry a similar sort of payload, anything between 500 kilograms of explosives. Some estimates the North Korean variant can take up to 1.5
tons and might have a range of up to 700 kilometers. This missile, we believe, hit an area of forest outside the capital, creating a huge, very dramatic crater about 30 to 40 foot wide and blowing down trees for hundreds of feet all around it, damaging homes much further away, but luckily no one was killed. That would appear to be consistent with the previous Korean missile strikes earlier in the war, which have not impacted, which have not appeared to hit any specific targets. It's not clear whether they've been misfired, misaimed, or defeated, shot down.